All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Mayshawn Wilson signing on for the War Room to the Boardroom podcast. I'm your host. Currently do strategic deals and business operations at Apple. I'm a combat veteran, Duke MBA, and West Pointer. And the purpose of our podcast here is to help minority service members kind of navigate that transition from service, whether it's from VA benefits, career exploration, and kind of figuring all that out. And so if you'd like to follow us on our page on Spotify or LinkedIn, please do so. Today we have a distinguished guest, Mr. William Tunde Osilaja, and he and I will be discussing kind of preparing to transitioning into education and human capital consulting. I'm going to call him Tunde because that's normally how we go back and forth. So Tunde is a human capital consultant at Deloitte, a former Army Infantry Officer, former West Point Diversity Admissions Officer, and a charter school business operations officer. He's also a graduate of West Point and the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. So without further delay, Tunde, please take the floor from here.
Absolutely. It's good to be here, Mayshawn. We go back 15 years, yeah. 17, something like that. Not 17.
We're
getting up there. We're getting up there. But it's cool to see what you're doing. You've got multiple projects, and I kind of look up to some of the stuff that you're doing. But you and others in our class, it's just really cool to see what we're up to after these 15 years. So glad to be here and looking forward to, the next hour of chatting with you.
Definitely. Yeah. So to start off for our listeners, Tunde, can you just tell us a little about who you are, kind of where you're coming from, and kind of what brought you into the military?
Yeah. So I grew up in a town called Evanston, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, but it's kind of unique in the sense that it really is socio and economically diverse and also racially diverse. And being I'm biracial, growing up in that environment was really helpful for me to sort of figure out who I am and who I was. And part of that process is learning about people, and you have to really understand different types of people in order to connect with them. And given the vast array of different races and ethnic groups and religions, I was fortunate enough to have to learn and sort of be able to pivot and sort of exercise that muscle of, observing people and understanding and being empathetic. And, when I was thinking about where to go to college, I knew it was something that, a place where I had to deal with people, where that was part of the core values of that college. And so for me, jumping into the military was really more so about, I want to go to West Point. I want to go to this place that, you have to work with people. You have to connect with others in order to be successful. And that's kind of what originally led me to the military. I served for 5 years. I did a lot of different things. My last job was, I worked as an admissions officer, following in your footsteps at school back at West Point, and really just uncovered this passion for education and mentorship and working with students. And when I transitioned out of the military, a big part of my transition was trying to figure out, how could I incorporate this mentorship, this connection with students on the outside, while still maintaining some of the skills that I built up through, my, 9-10 years in the military. So I tried to think about what that looked like and ended up working at a charter school in operations. And I was an operations manager for an elementary school in the Bronx. And I got to sort of use some of my operations experience, working with people management experience, but then also having to deal with kids every day. That was a great time. I learned how to work with kids, and I didn't have brother and sister growing up, not till much later in my life, so really got to sort of scratch that itch and work with kids and see how kids grow. It's an amazing experience. Afterwards, I worked in the charter school for about 2 years, and then decided I want to go get my MBA, and kind of looking back on it now, I almost wish I was a little bit more intentional. It was kind of like, well, everyone in the military is going to get their MBA, so let me go do that. And on one end, it was a good intro to the business world. On the other end, I think had I been a little bit more intentional, and there are ways to do that, but had I a little bit more intentional, I could have sort of carved out a path that was, more tailored to my skill set. But I did 2 years in University of Michigan at Ross, had a great time, and decided to work in consulting, which is another people management, relationship management business, albeit at a way higher level. Um, and I've been at Deloitte for about 2 years, and I love the job. I love the challenges of being consultant. It sharpened my skills in many ways that needed to be sharpened, and I'm just excited to see where the future leads.
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah,
So when you talk about kind of your family background, your kind of relationship building, operating across many different intersectional identities, I
yeah,
guess what kind of drew you to the military? Did you have family in the military, friends? Like,
yeah.
what was it that was like, hey, I want this experience compared to, say, another university, or was it sports that drew you there? Like, what was it that
Yeah,
kind of was that drive?
if I'm looking back on it, I think there was sort of this seed that was planted. Um, my dad was in the military. Being an immigrant, he really wanted to sort of pay back America. Sort of giving him his citizenship and all the liberties that come with it. So he served for about 5 6 years in the reserves, and that was just sort of in the periphery of my childhood. I also had a grandfather that served in World War II, and just remember growing up, my mom, we called him Gakadak. Gakadak, would just see pictures of his boat. He was on a famous ship called the USS Indianapolis. He obviously had some stories to tell, and I think just that kind of got embedded into what I wanted to do. And I went and visited West Point. To all my mom and my dad, there it was this complete like, what are you military? What? It was just this complete, and it's funny given both of their backgrounds that they were so surprised. But when I went to West Point, it was just like, this is my home. Like this is where I need to be. I've been fortunate enough to use the experiences that I gained there to be successful in life in different things and be happy and sort of put myself on a growth trajectory that is really helping me fulfill my passions.
No, that,
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah, yeah,
And so, kind of now that you touched on kind of where you are,
yeah,
who you were kind of coming into the military, can you talk a little bit about like how did you get here to this human capital consulting? You mentioned kind of your last job in the army was outreach. And so how did you kind of think about one, when to leave, and then two, how did you do that discovery process of figuring out what you wanted to do? Because I know that can be challenging for a lot of veterans.
yeah. I think kind of the first question, when to leave. Um, there the military. There's sort of these natural inflection points of like where hey, this is should I stay? Should I leave? Should I go to Triple C? Should I, after the admissions job, I'd served for 5 years. It was either, get out, go to Triple C, and I was a branch transfer. So I came in as infantry, but I was going to transfer to Signal. I had no experience in Signal, obviously, wasn't particularly excited about it. That gave me the ammo to make the decision to transition out, and I think that if circumstances were different, if I was straight infantry, um, I might have that might have been a longer internal conversation with myself. But I think I sort of decided like this is what my future looks like. I'm not particularly excited about that future, and so what can I do to make me excited? That's kind of been my north star as I've journeyed through the different experiences and opportunities after that. I think there's this sort of big people component that has made up that North Star. And so working in the school, working in the charter school, obviously you're working with kids. Kids are people. Some days they might not seem like that, but it was a very interesting experience because, you know, you have to know how to communicate very well with kids, because there's no room for sarcasm. Kids aren't quite, at least at the age group that I worked with, kids don't get sarcasm. You can't say something, they'll take it literally. You know, kids, their minds are all over the place. So if you're not very clear with your direction, you're not going to be as successful as the next person. And so working in the school really gave me this like doctorate in communication, on what it means to convey information in a way that your recipient can receive it. And it just kind of funneled this idea of working with people. Okay, well, you like to work with people, you have to communicate with people, you have to know how to communicate with people. What does that look like in business school? How can I sort of leverage these skills at the next level? And originally I went back to back to school and went to business school because I wanted to work in nonprofit. That's what I want to do. I like this service, this mission driven job. And I think once I got to business school, the realities of what that looked like kind of hit me. Shannon,
Our
our
MLT coach, yeah.
MLT coach, she always, this quote of hers sticks in my head of, you know, everyone wants to save the world and be a millionaire, and it's hard to do that unless, very specific situations where, maybe you just have come into money or you've built up money over time and now you can do that. But it's really hard to just do that in the mainstream. And I think that I realized that I want to be comfortable in my life. And like the first week or two of business school, it was kind of like, like I can't, all the essays and time and the narratives that I built trying to get into school, you know, now I've got to pivot from that. And so what does that look like? In business school, and particularly at Ross, at the University of Michigan. Michigan is a very consultant-friendly business school. There's a big pipeline between Ross and a lot of the consultant firms out there. And so for me, it was kind of like this. I could see myself doing this. What opportunities are there for me, for someone like me with my experience and interests in consulting? I sort of was at this info session where someone said the word human capital consultant, and it's, well, what's human capital consulting? What does that mean? Well, human capital consulting is, a particular branch of consulting where you're working with the workforce to enhance productivity, to achieve mission goals, to make more money, to decrease costs, increase profit, whatever that looks like. You're leveraging the workforce to do that. And for me, who spent this entire time really trying to understand people and how people operate, that spoke to me. And so that was kind of like my natural transition into human capital consulting. I did, the whole recruiting thing. I did a summer associate stint at Deloitte in their DC office. I was lucky enough to get an offer to come back full time, and have been there ever since. And I've been on a lot of different projects since then. And I think you have your idea of what consulting is and what sort of the theoretical understanding of consulting is and what people say in sort of the seminars and what you read about. And then there's actually what consulting is. There's a big difference, there's some similarities, but there are some differences. And, sort of learning that real world experience has been pleasure of mine. It's just understanding, new ground to learn about, and different ways that people operate, even past your original expectations of that. experience. So that's kind of what led me to where I am today.
No, that's very helpful. So if I pulled out of that correctly, communication, especially learning how to communicate with children,
Yeah,
uh, really important. And then kind of understanding what you enjoyed either about the military or your experiences growing up to kind of drive your passion and figuring out your career discovery going forward is kind of what I pulled out of that. So
yeah. To kind of like sort of summarize everything, the military is very good at telling you what to do, when to do it, and it's easy to fall into that. I think one thing that, as you're transitioning out, and maybe even before, is really sort of developing the sense of what do I want? What do I enjoy? What can I do to be happy? What can I do to develop my passions? And I think developing that muscle of like checking in with yourself, to me, that's sort of what helps people transition a little bit more effectively. If you're sitting in something that you like, that you're going to be successful at that. So how do you do that? Well, you're going through this process of constant reevaluating. You try something out, it's not what you thought it was. Well, then you sort of put yourself in a position to pivot. And I think just being open and transparent and vulnerable around a lot of those different things, I think will help those that want to transition a little bit more smoothly.
that makes sense. So understanding the difference between something as it's preached versus how it's practiced. So almost like say what you were taught in an academy class versus when you actually go out and deploy as an infantry officer, or probably similar to IBOLIC. Would you say that's a fair comparison, or
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's theory and there's practice, and how something is based in theory, it almost always materializes different. So I think like that's everywhere I've gone, I've had to like, oh, I learned this, but I need to do this, and I think that's definitely a good point that you raise.
that makes sense? And so, as you were thinking about your transition, would you say you were planning like, would you say like 12 months out, 24 months out? Like, what was that time frame where you're like, okay, my branch transfer is coming up. I'm starting to think about, okay, I think about getting out, and like, when should people start thinking about that? If that makes sense.
Yeah. For me, I have to know what I'm doing. I like to have a 5 year plan, so like that's it's easier for me to sort of be focused in the day to day if I kind of know what those actions are, how those actions are going to get me to a place I need to go. I think about 12 months out, I got to West Point to be the admissions officer in maybe June of that year to start the cycle. And at that point, I was already researching like what does Signal Triple C look like? What's my career going to look like? And I started talking to different mentors, and I think I decided maybe during that fall that this isn't for me. You know, is there recourse? Can I just go straight infantry? And there were hurdles around that. So I was very anxious around that. It's a very anxiety inducing time. Um, I think that if you have a family, you probably need a longer runway. So, you have a little bit more cushion. If you're single, and you're sort of open to moving around, maybe your runway is a little bit shorter. I think it's really just, um, it's person dependent. It's how much anxiety you hold around that. I held a lot, so I wanted to give myself ample time. But yeah, I mean, I think it just kind of depends. At the end of the day, it just depends on the person.
No, I would say that's very true. I
Yeah,
gave myself like similar to you. I had like a 5, 10, 20 year plan. And I
yeah,
was like, okay, if I like this and I see captains and majors I want to be like, great. But probably about 2 years out, I was like, okay, this is enough.
yeah,
Let's try
yeah,
something else.
yeah,
And so along those lines, you ultimately decided to go to business school in human capital consulting.
hmm
Compared to people that say go straight to business school or straight into industry, I guess, can you talk about that thought process of doing education and then going to the business school route versus say the front end, kind of talk about your thought process.
Yeah. So I'll start off with you bloom where you planted, right? So, things might not necessarily fall the way that you thought they would, but you make the best of it. My plan was to maybe get out and go straight to business school, you know. So I remember, studying for the GMAT, while at admissions, and kind of like I would basically after work, I would spend like 2-3 hours at my desk, studying for the GMAT. And, I am one of those lovely, lucky individuals that has to work outside of standardized test scores to prove my competence because I'm not the best test taker. And, the first go round of the GMAT, I didn't have scores that would put me in a position to be at a school that I wanted to. So my plan B was then to, um, move to working in industry, and call it industry. I worked in nonprofit. Looking back on that, that was the best thing that could have happened. Um, I think there is as much as there's a shift, personally going from the military to outside of the military, there's a huge culture shift, and for us, you know, we started off, you know, all of our adulthood, started was in the military. So you grow up, this is what 18, 19, 20 years, you're the core years of your adulthood are being defined by this very specific, very, unique culture that only exists, within that subset. And so now you're going straight from that to a completely different culture. There's a learning curve. There's a huge learning curve. And even now, I've been to business school, I've worked in, a nonprofit, even in consulting still, there is a shift that I'm sort of still having to sort of navigate through. And so I say all that to say, when you're navigating that transition, it's really about, to me, individual preference of what do you think is going to be the best fit for you. If you're intending to go to business school, business school is such a it is there's it's a period of learning. There's so much to learn technically, but also you're building relationships, you're forming networks. If you can offload culture shift from that, cultural learning, if you can maybe go off and work in industry and understand corporate America, that's the word I'm looking for. If you can sort of embed that in your body, and then now you go to business school, that's one less thing you have to worry about. Now you can focus on building relationships and being present in class and sort of focusing on yourself so you can drive your passions and sort of pick a job that you want. Now, people are built differently, and maybe there are faster learners out there that can sort of navigate those challenges a little bit more succinctly. But for me, I think that's the route. I think if I had to do it again, I would do it the same way. To me, that's sort of the best practice, if you will.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, adjusting to corporate cultures, even professional services into technology or
Yeah,
finance, they all have very different cultures in the military. And I think learning those is probably the biggest hurdle compared to just like technical skills by themselves. So I
yeah,
agree. That makes perfect sense.
absolutely.
And then also utilizing that time to like prepare for the GMAT and know where you want to go. Because I think a
Yeah,
lot of people don't realize how time intensive that process can be. I think when I studied around the same time, so we were like 2015, 2014, around there, it was like in order to get a 700, you have to put in at least 100 hours, 150 hours plus to get to a 700. And like,
yeah,
it's a tall order.
yeah. Very, very tall order. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to, that break is such a shocking break in many different ways that, I think you really just have to understand what your priorities are. For me, my priority was to, looking back on it now, I wanted to spend less time having to navigate a culture in order to learn business more efficiently. I was able to sort of come in and, okay, like this is how civilians talk to each other. Okay, this makes sense, you know?
Uh,
Yeah.
can you talk about how you navigated understanding the culture? So yes, the military has a culture of its own. It tends to be very majority focused. As someone who is kind of biracial, multiracial, how did
Yeah.
you navigate that space? Since both the military and corporate America tend to be very majority in their skew and very male dominated.
Yeah. This is just one example of many different types of cultures. So I think being in consulting and being in the military, I think it's a good study in direct communication, because on one end, in the military, you have to be very direct with your community. It's very direct. People will tell you, you F lieutenant, like
Mm-hmm.
get your stuff together,
All the time.
Um, and so when you grow up in that culture, you know, you that's how you communicate. That's how you receive feedback. Someone tells you you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you need to fix this. This was okay, cool. So if you're used to hearing that directness, and now you're transitioning into a different environment. I bring up consulting because to me, consulting is on the other opposite end of the spectrum with directness. You know,
Yeah, most
someone will
definitely.
give you feedback and it's like critical feedback, but you might hear it as a compliment. Well, like, yeah, I'm good. And they're telling you suck, but in very nice terms.
Oh yeah.
And I think that navigating the transition is really all about uh, perceiving others. You have to be very perceptive, especially in an indirect environment. I just said this. They kind of responded a little weird. Like, did I, maybe I should have said something, or maybe I should have phrased it differently. And I've had talks with mentors that have been in the military that have said, hey, this is different. Like this is, you know, the business format of consulting is you're working with clients, you're in this space of we don't want this negative energy with the client. So if there's this principle of yes and I don't know if maybe you had something different at your and when in your consulting experience. But yes and if the client asks you to do something and you're like, no, we're not doing that, you're, you're not saying no. you know you're saying, oh, yes, and we'll have to maybe talk to our SMEs to get a little bit more clarity on the ask, and we'll have to talk to our managing director to understand. Like you give this answer that kind of is a no, but in a nice way, and that's just kind of consulting. It's in the military. Can you do this? No, Lieutenant. Go back and rethink your plan. Like it's a very specific. So how do you navigate those two worlds? What does that look like? You have to be humble. You have to be perceptive. You have to you have to understand and talk to people to understand sort of uh, you know the best ways to communicate. Now add in you know the racial factor, and I think that's just another flair that adds a layer of complexity to it. If I were advising someone to transition, where how to transition from the military, going to consulting, that's a tough transition, culturally. Maybe find a culture that is maybe a step below the military in that sense. Because again, the more dramatic swing that is, the higher learning curve it is for you, and you're spending more time on communicating and cultural understanding than you are about actually doing your job or the technical part of it. So definitely a big piece is culture and communication for sure.
No, I think I could not have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Similar struggles in consulting And I will say that, if you're in a big four firm like us, or even, McKinsey, Bain, BCG, or other consulting firms, I would say most veterans have a similar struggle, even if cultures and sizes vary to a degree.
Yeah,
I'd
absolutely.
wager. I'd wager. And so, kind of taking a step back and like how you got here, were there any specific programs that you use to kind of help with this transition? I think we talked about MLT a second ago, but did you use anything like a JMO program that Deloitte has, or anything else to kind of help figure out your transition process from the military into business or consulting?
I didn't. I mean, outside of MLT, which is more of it's less of a military focused organization. I almost wish I had, because a lot of the learning that I did, that I have accumulated, has come through mistakes I've made, or times I've put my foot in my mouth, or just different circumstances where I just didn't understand the situation. um so I think a lot of that indirect communication learning has come through times where I have maybe missed something, or I've been a little bit too direct, or you know um I think that if there's any opportunity for someone to be in a program that helps transition, helps with your transition, absolutely, you know, take up that offer. But to me, much more than any individual program, is just the learning that comes with talking to different people. You know, because people, at the end of the day, that's where the information is. If you're able to sit down and understand someone's experience and how they navigated a particular situation, to me, that's the best way to accumulate knowledge. When you're in those programs, you get a higher access to people, but you also have the opportunity to talk to people outside of those programs. So, as long as you can kind of focus in on, making networking and talking to people that have transitioned part of your transition plan, that's sort of the best case scenario.
No, that makes perfect sense. You mentioned a number of the lessons that you learned about, communication and, how do people deliver feedback in different cultures. Were there any particular, I guess, guides that kind of helped you figure out that process? Maybe it was like a book or a podcast, um, anything that kind of helped you with that transition. And I think you also mentioned mentors,
Yeah,
were those mainly like Army mentors, West Point mentors, other veterans?
yeah. I think part of it is just you just got to jump in the deep end, and and sink or swim. Yeah, I mean, I think that when I was in Michigan, when I was at Ross, they had some, like, low context versus high context communication training, which was interesting to kind of see that across different cultures. Where you needed more context to understand the dialogue versus less context to understand the dialogue. So that was an interesting study that I sort of incorporated into, like, my perspective. But yeah, at the end of the day, you just you jump in and you learn, and that's kind of to me, that's the best way. As long as you're perceptive, I think the biggest thing is have self-awareness. Just don't go into a setting and just start, not reading people and not hearing others' feedback, and not having any awareness of how you exist in that space. But we're all different. We're all gonna, that's the beauty of people, is we're all different. As long as we can sort of work together to sort of be at harmony, that's I think everything else kind of shakes out.
No, I'd agree. As I take things like a Myers-Briggs test or even some of the career leader tests, kind of help me figure out some of that, where you're like,
Yeah,
oh, this is how other people receive me. That's good to know.
yeah. There is, I'm sure there's a version of this at a lot of different places. At Deloitte, it's called business chemistry. It's sort of this proprietary, framework. I think there's a book called Business Chemistry, actually. At Michigan, there's the Michigan model of leadership. And they're essentially the same thing, just sort of framework differently. But um, these these frameworks sort of divide communication styles, learning styles, leadership styles into four quadrants. Someone who's a communicator, someone who's sort of a creator, someone who's kind of like they call it a driver, but someone who likes to sort of, push. I don't know the exact verbiage of it, but someone who's kind of like, let's go, let's get it done. It's more of like the drill sergeant. And then the person that kind of like is very detail oriented, wants to follow the rules, needs to be meticulous and sort of how they go about things. Those are the four quadrants someone can fall into. And people have different, maybe different uh, flavors of other ones. Like I'm primarily a creator, but I have flavors of the collaborator, the sort of people person. Um, so learning that, you then become much more self-aware. And then you're able to read others and follow this framework that allows you to better communicate with different types of people, to better sort of understand how others operate. So if I'm working with someone that is a driver and they're sort of pushing the group and being forceful, um, it's not that they're a meanie. It's not they're being a jerk. That's just how they communicate. And so I can put my defenses down because you know, that's Mayshawn is just that's how he rolls. That's he's someone that likes to have his, he wants to follow the deadline. He wants to make sure everything's good to go. Um, and so I can then accept you and work with you and sort of, that's kind of the gist of it. So I would say that's a very good framework. And I think you just gotta like Google Deloitte business chemistry or, Michigan model of leadership. I know there's different types and iterations of it. So that would be one framework that I think I've leaned on.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think kind of, some of our final notes, if you had to look back on your transition process, is there anything that you would change, whether it was kind of your last assignment, how you looked your benefits, education, your career field, any of those items particularly that you would change about your transition
Yeah,
all over again?
yeah. I wish I was more intentional. And it's funny because back then when I was going through it, I thought I was being very intentional. And what I didn't realize was I needed to I needed to talk to more people. Yeah, my n equals number was like n equals 5, and it needed to be n equals 50 or more, more than that. Get more data points about what's out there so that you can make an informed decision, about what's best. There's a perfect job, there's a perfect situation for everyone, and I think that my career has slowly but surely gotten me to that point, and I'm not there yet. I don't regret anything that I've done, but at the same time, I know that there is something out there that um, makes me more passionate, that will wake me up more quickly in the morning. That's gonna energize me a little bit more frenetically, or a little bit more strongly um, when I'm working through it. So I think uh, as I've talked to more people, I'm slowly but surely figuring out what that is. Um, but that's the only thing. And I don't think that's something that you can just do differently. I think it's more just realizing that people are going to give you information to help you inform your decisions. And so if you can talk to as many people as possible from all walks of life, that to me, that's something that I wish I could have done more of and will continue to do more of in the future.
No, I would agree. Agree with that.
Yeah.
And so for our listeners that kind of want to continue following your story and learn more about you, like where can they do that? Do you have like a, LinkedIn that you want them to follow or
Yeah.
any other media presence?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn, just search my name, William, or I think it's Tunde Osilaja, not William Tunde Osilaja. But LinkedIn is, I love to connect with people. I always love it when someone, kind of cold emails me or cold messages me and is just, hey, tell me about Deloitte or tell me about Michigan or, whatever the case. I love having those conversations. So would love to start a one-on-one with anyone that wants to connect with me there.
Most definitely. And then kind of last piece, are there any kind of like initiatives or other like projects that you're working on that you want to share with our listeners?
And then Mason, you actually got me in this game, the real estate investment game. Yeah, I mean that's kind of been my biggest project of late. So I think that's a great that's something that takes up my time. Also joined officially the West Point Field Force, which for
Nice.
those that don't know is the recruiting arm. It's a volunteer network of recruiting folks that supplement the admissions team at West Point. So I was formerly admissions officer. Now I'm field force, and looking to get the next Mayshawn Wilson into West Point. So
there it is. Well, yeah. We appreciate your time so much. Thank you for sharing your nuggets of wisdom, and we'll keep you posted once we publish. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.